Okay, so here we are at the picking or classifying tables. Up there, the coal comes off the shakers, and this is where larger lumps of coal, rock, or other foreign objects would end up. These tables would have a slow shaking motion, just as though of the classifying tables. Here, men would sit, usually one or two per side. There's two tables here, two tables on the other side. And they'd pick off stuff such as this wood and throw it down the chute, or if there was a lump too big, they'd smash it with a sledgehammer, and then it would be passed on to a crusher. Now, most of these crushers have been removed, but there's one here on the front. These crushers would be operating at a fairly high RPM, and the coal would dump right in between these crushers. Now, there's a set of crushers for every floor on this breaker. The larger the teeth, and the further they are apart, would yield larger sized coal. For example, egg coal, chestnut coal. And the smaller the teeth, the closer together, you would get smaller coal, such as barley, rice, or pea coal. And after this gets crushed, there's another set of shakers underneath that would classify the size. The large size would run off, and the whole process would be repeated again. Now here we have the main classifying or shaker room, I like to call it. We skipped a few floors here because on the first few floors coming down from the breaker, it's mostly all screens and classifying, because that's all a breaker is to crush the coal and make it smaller to a certain size for the customer in need. Now here in the shaker room, there's a few of the offset cams that I pointed out earlier. They're offset just like as a camshaft in your car to operate the tables. As you can see here, from end to end, this whole room was all shaker tables. Wherever these boards are, they're called stringer boards. These are where these tables were suspended. You could see remains of some of these tables here. Now from here on, now that the coal is small enough, it would be sent on to what was brand new, never heard of in the anthracite region, which was called a Menzies cone. This replaced the infamous breaker buoys. This used water to separate coal and rock, other than boys picking the rock out. Another very interesting thing about this breaker that you can't see here, but I'll show you later, is underneath these tables here, when you first started out, you'd have a steel bottom under these tables to catch the coal. But you have to remember, every time this coal is being broken, it's being washed also. It's called a wet process of breaking coal. Now, it's all right to have steel tables, but as you keep washing it, it keeps getting more acidic. The smaller the coal gets, the tables change. Next may be stainless steel. After stainless steel, you'll have a terracotta tile basin under the tables. And then lastly, for your smallest rice or power plant coal, you will actually have glass tiles under the tables. That's because the acidity that's being built up from washing will deteriorate your table underneath. As you could also note here, this is a good spot to see, are all the windows around us. This is a dawn of a new age in anthracite coal processing. Before, you had old wooden breakers that were not as nearly as this size, wouldn't yield as much coal. They weren't high productive breakers, in other words. They would only put out maybe 1,000 tons a day. As you can see with these windows, all modern breakers like to use natural lighting. As you can see, today is a fairly clear day, and you can see how well lit this is. And there were lights in here for working at night also. So at this point now, the coal is going to pass on to the Menzies cones, which we'll show you next. Okay, so now these are the Menzies cones. I'm standing in the second of 5 Menzies cones. These are the last 5 Menzies cones on the entire planet that are still in place right here in this breaker. Now the way these Menzies cones would work is there's a small chute in the center here where the coal would be loaded in. These cones would have a large amount of water in them with a heavy media process such as like a magnetite or a carbon solution to make the water thicker. Now the way the process this works is on top, as you can see on the other ones, there's a gear on top which would turn agitators. You could also see that there are a number of nozzles inside to also move the water in a circular motion, cyclone motion. Now, in theory, coal is lighter than rock, and because of the water being thick, the coal will float up over the top and empty out instead of having to pick out every individual piece of rock. Now, where I'm standing here is actually, I guess you could call it the exit of the Menzies cone, or the overflow. This little dam or trough that you see on the side here, the coal would float up and out of the Menzies cone onto a shaker or classifier table, which are right here to be processed onward throughout the breaker. Now here we are looking at the top of a Menzies cone. Right there is the chute where it would be loaded into the top of the cone here. Now you can see, as I was saying before, all the nozzles inside of this cone. And you can see where it would overflow into this trough around the cone here, into the overflow, which would empty out into your classifier screens. Now here we are in another part of the breaker where there's lots of classifier screens. As you can see here, this is what I've been referring to as the offset cam. You can see the remains of the motor that would spin these cams, and they're offset to push the arms back and forth, almost as on a steam engine to shake the table.
They move in a reciprocating fashion.
Yeah. Now, this whole process is a wet process. Every time the coal is crushed, it is being washed. And every time the coal gets finer and finer, the water gets more acidic. Now, that being so, as you start off breaking the coal, you have beds to catch the coal under these shakers. And it starts off as steel. Now, the steel, if you use that for small coal, it would quickly disintegrate from the acidity in the water. So lining the underneath of these beds, as it got smaller, they'd have terracotta next, which would resist the acid. And then as you come down to these have glass beds on them. You can see a lot of the glass is busted up now. You can see how thick that this glass is, almost a ½ inch thick of glass that would line the underneath of these tables here to catch the coal and resist wear and acidity. Now you can see the difference of screen sizes here. Here you have a large screen size, and here's a smaller screen size. You'd have smaller and smaller all the way down going on these screens. And all these trays are suspended by what are called springer boards, which are essentially oak planks that would swing back and forth with the movement of these shaker tables. Now here's another unique feature of the breaker here. This little extension off the main conveyor that you may have been wondering about, that is so if you have foreign coal from a different colliery or say a smaller breaker or washery, the bottom would drop out of the main conveyor, and the new coal that may be already sized and picked free of rock and wood would come down this conveyor to specifically be only washed by the Menzies cone and maybe processed further to smaller coal and then be dyed blue and shipped out.